So I'm going to say hello, B-Sides Knoxville. So my song was hello, and that was why. So anyway, my name's Christine Horwege, and I've been in Knoxville about 11, 12 years now, and had an opportunity to work at multiple companies in the area as well as in consulting. And so currently I'm a director of cyber for CGI, and I work with the federal clientele doing cyber advisory and programs. So I thought this would be fitting. I've done cyber programs for over 15 years now, and I have worked with multiple clients and also companies supporting development of metrics, development of the program. And so one of the things that I typically run into right away is this like aversion to metrics, this idea that they're hard. What are we actually measuring? Are we going to be, is it going to count against us? And so what I will say is, not being an engineer by trade or practice, just start somewhere. It just, that barrier of like, we've got to get everything right, it's got to be 100%, just start somewhere. And when you start to learn more from the metrics you do start with, you'll actually start to develop more metrics, and it will actually get better over time. The other thing is I'll talk about design. So that's the other thing is what we talk about, vulnerabilities you can pull from any system. Well, what are some metrics that I can design? And then how do I layer those metrics so that they meet the needs of all of my organization? I'm not just going to do board reporting, or I'm not just going to do business unit, or even just cyber teams. I'm going to look at how do I have metrics across my organization so I can support all levels, and then why those metrics are valuable and what you should be doing with them. Additionally, we'll talk about the program. So when I talk about a cyber program, I'll actually define it for you, but it's really that collection of all the initiatives. You guys have been here today learning about processes. You've been learning about tools and technologies. When you want to put all of those together, you should create this program in order to show that return on investment, show how they all help each other out, or where security is actually reducing your risk or making your business process more effective, or even just securing that value of your company that you're trying to build through your DevOps. And then I'll go over some dashboards. It's more just for visuals, but I will talk about kind of the value there and where you can differentiate and how you create your dashboard. But the real objective here is really to get people past that, really the barrier or your hesitation to putting metrics out there. Metrics are going to help you. They're going to put your program in play, and then also they're going to help you define specific things that you want to measure. So going back to that cyber program, how many of you out there currently have a cyber program? You may call it an information security program at your company and are currently putting together a portfolio of projects. Not very many, so that's interesting. One of the things that I hope you take away today, like I said, I do have a whole approach. I have dashboards, I have metrics that we've written or that I've written and put in here. Please reach out to me. I'm willing to share everything I have. I've been doing this, like I said, for over 10, 15 years. I have a lot of materials. So cyber program, what is that? I define it as, again, it can be an MIS program, it can be a cyber security program. The program itself is really bringing together those initiatives. So when you think about people, process, and technology, we have to be able to see how they come together. We want to measure them from end to end, and we want to show the value of how those initiatives are really driving towards reducing the risk for the organization, enabling it to meet its objectives, and how security plays into that. I typically do not put cybersecurity together right away. I like cyber risk because I think cyber risk is different. It's that probability of the loss or the adverse impact event that is going to really prevent you from meeting those bigger objectives. It's where's my loss of availability, confidentiality, or integrity for my data systems, network, processes, again, that could go on and on. Whereas security or cybersecurity, security posture is really when I define it as the evaluation of how your controls or your frameworks or your standards, how are you lining up to what you said you were going to do and your expected outcomes? And typically, I will say it is compliance related, and I will just say it that way. Security is a control function. It is set to oversight your IT activities and your business processes, so it is typically aligned with a compliance concept. This I will show you again some different metrics I've seen around that or dashboards, but again, I just like to differentiate that because one of the big things that I always come to the table with my leadership is that you can be secure but not even touch the risks that are actually hitting you. And that's why I say it typically can align with your compliance programs. Now, I work with the federal government a lot, and I've also worked with federal entities. This is typically the case. It's very focused on the compliance, the requirements, the frameworks, whether it's NIST, whether it's CMMC, how can I meet those requirements? And then ultimately, it needs to come full circle back to the risk, whereas the indicator should help you with that. So I have performance and risk indicators. Risk indicators are really letting you know when something's coming at you. And I always like to give the example of, I drove in this morning, lots of traffic, or for those of you in this area, there's lots of traffic. I came from the DC area, that's a joke for traffic. I'm coming in and all of a sudden it's jamming up again right as I'm coming towards the city and I see the brake lights. Indicator, I need to change my behavior. I need to think about how I'm going to respond to the traffic ahead of me. Whereas key performance indicators are really about how you're doing. So when we talk about program success, we're going to talk about those performance indicators. How do I make sure that I know I'm meeting the objective or the expected outcome that I have? And interestingly enough, before we talked about governance, and so the previous presenter said, okay, governance. I agree. I typically live in the governance world, but the way I also talk about is roles and responsibilities and different levels of the organization. Because if you think about your strategic level and your board reports, your business leader reports, and then also your cyber reports at your team level or even your end user level, they're all going to be different, but they should be synchronized to, again, support the bigger objectives of your company and meet those goals and produce value for the organization. So one of the analogies that I like to use is I go to the doctor. And so if you think about it, measuring your vitals is the first thing you do at every doctor's appointment. You walk in, they say step on the scale, my least favorite activity when I get there. It just brings it down or right up. And then of course they hit my blood pressure. Well, that's already elevated again. And so then they go and check, my temperature. In the COVID days, it's getting a little less. But then they also ask me questions. They say, how are you feeling? Do you have pain anywhere? So it's really those indicators. Is there potentially something wrong? Should they go further, test further? Do you think they jump right into, hey, let's go do an MRI scan, let's do a CAT scan? No, because one, they're expensive, two, timely, and three, I never have enough time to get to all those different appointments. So what I like to do is say, hey, if I have something wrong, let me know. So how is this information being shared with me? Are we talking, jumping right from I have a pain in my back to back surgery? No, I'm talking through what the implications or what the impact could be, what could be causing it, and what those root causes are. And then also thinking about vitals from an indicator perspective, they should be aligned with my objective. I'm trying to get healthier. I'm trying to bring my blood pressure down. And they also provide context for those next steps. So my doctor is giving me some activities. My all-time favorite is my heart doctor loves to tell me, don't eat red meat. And I said, yeah, that's never gonna happen. So I tell him, I gotta live a little. And so he says, yeah, just don't order it then. I have to make it myself. So I try to do that on the grill. But that's really where you can kind of set yourself up, very similar to taking those vitals. Now, good practices when developing metrics is really around, again, the audience. Think about your audience. I kind of came up in the GRC world where it was the right time, right person, right metric, or right information. Very relevant in that your strategic metrics should be saved for those at the top, the senior leadership, your board. It's really not going to do you a lot of good to share those metrics with your team that's acting on the ground thinking, okay, it's great, but what does that mean to me? So your operational metrics, you're really looking at, that's where it starts to get into the processes and the technologies. What's that interaction? How can I change that interaction? And then your tactical, again, your outcomes of your staffs. And they're going to be outcome driven. They're going to tie back, but they're going to be relevant for that, tactical, everyday, day-to-day. What do you need me to do? Now, your metrics, my all-time favorite is need to have decisions or actions. I always used to ask my clients, you're gonna have me gather all this data, we're gonna put these metrics together, what are you doing about it? And they're like, what do you mean? Well, you're not gonna make a decision, you're not gonna change what you're doing. Oh no, I just wanna know what's happening. No, that just takes time and energy that no one has. If you're not gonna change anything or you're not gonna make a decision or change your actions, then you really need to think about that metric and step back for a minute and say, okay, what can I actually measure that I can then do something with? Also, operational improvements or revenue gains. So going back to that value, if you're gonna add value, but again, it's about how will I respond or will I respond? If you're not willing to respond to any of those metrics, don't measure them right away. Work on other ones that actually give you some action. And then I love my favorite is keep current or don't bother. People tend to just keep running metrics, or my all-time favorite was the board reporting. We'd spend 2 weeks putting the metrics together and they'd already be 2 weeks old. So as we're putting the slides together, like what are you supposed to do with that information? You can't act upon it, it's already old, so keep it relevant, and that's helpful. So as I was talking about the organization, those roles and responsibilities, one of the things you want to do is communicate right up front. What are the layers? Now these are 3 layers, and I'll show you where I got my reference from after, but these are typically the 3 layers you see. And it talks about the different levels of metrics that you should be thinking about for that specific group. So if you're talking about your board and executives, they want to know what your risks are. What are the risks to those objectives? That's the real focus, but also that cyber program approach. They want to say, overarching, what are you addressing? What are your initiatives and where's the spend going? Going back to the business, or going down to the business leader level, you're really looking at that overall state. One of the things I always like to say about business leader metrics, it goes back to where's the money? It's the show me the money. What are you spending money on? What are you measuring when you do that? Because that's what they care about. They often hold the dollars and they'll put the money where it matters. And that's where you get into your risk treatment actions or your plans, your business plans. Your operational team level metrics, that's gonna again go back to that day-to-day tactical. They're gonna wanna know where those KRIs are. What am I looking for? What's my triggers? Where do I need to either alert someone, escalate? What's important to then measure and roll up? Or what do I need to be aware of if I need to change my behavior, set an incident response in place? Those are those kind of metrics you wanna have at that team level. And I get this from, and I find the most valuable that I've used and I've seen is the NIST cybersecurity framework. This is their outline of what it looks like to do, an organizational tiered approach of building metrics, communicating, and then working through a cyber program. I have seen this work in every instance I've looked at. You can take the NIST off it, but in the end, NIST CSF, they give the whole outline, they help you identify those roles and responsibilities, and they really show you how this comes together from a communication perspective. So now talking about cascading, what does this actually look like? So you're telling me, okay, I have all these metrics, great idea. So I'm saying, okay, operational metrics, I'm gonna look at a leading metric, and I'm gonna cascade it down. So my executive management, the policy adherence reduces risk of exploitation of critical assets. So I'm gonna look at policy adherence. That's gonna be my metric for them. How many times do I see that if I'm at a business unit level, I have a number of policy exceptions? Now I gotta tie those policy exceptions, so what? You have the exceptions. We all have them. I know we used to get carried away with ours. And then you have to look at it related to your number of issues. Because if you're having issues in those same areas that you have the policy exception, you really want to start to look at, should I be accepting that, or should I be changing my risk tolerance, or should I be thinking about that metric or that policy a little different and maybe update it? One of the things I always like to tell, again, my clients or even my business leaders when I worked with them, I'd say, so we have a policy. We're getting to a point where it's about every third interaction with this policy, we're giving exceptions. After about the first year of that, shouldn't we just review the policy and update it to think about those exceptions and maybe add them? And then we're not doing so many exceptions. And it was like, oh, that's really a good idea. Maybe I should do that. So again, measuring it gives you an action you can then think about to move forward. And then of course you have your cyber ops team. So those policy exceptions, they're going to be looking for those security alerts. They're going to be looking at those specific assets and where that policy is tied in, because they're going to feed into your issues. They're also going to be looking at the percent of critical assets that are assessed with deficiencies. That's typically where you're going to see your issues. If you have deficiencies, you're going to see issues. If you have exceptions, then you're going to see lack of policy adherence. You're definitely going to see increased risk in that area. So this ties back to an asset, a process, and again, a network or even a transaction that's going on. So these are the, like I said, the build up of a build down of a metric that then helps everyone in the organization understand where the risk is and also where they can be more secure. So I'm going to go into cyber program and the metrics that go with it. But I'm going to start off with the program. So what does a program look like? Now again, very generic. You don't have to start off with as much detail, but this really goes back to what's the program, and these are typically security programs or IT programs, and then what's the objective. So going back to your organizational capability, going back to what it ties to make your organization successful, think about your objectives, because again, that will help you set up what's the metric, what's a really valuable metric to ensure I'm meeting that objective and that it ties back to my organizational value. Now you can also see that we do have training and awareness. So your people side, you've got your data security and management, asset inventory, you've got your technology, and then we typically have a process, configuration or patch, change control. You're going to look at those processes. So you're trying to capture a little or one or two of each so that you make sure you measure all aspects of your program. Now this isn't a full one, but again, making it so it can fit on the slide. You can build it out, you can build it less. Making it readable for you is much more important to me at the time. So this is the approach, and I've actually used this approach, I've implemented it, and I've seen it work. One of the things that I would say when it comes to building any approach or any program is consistency. One, people understand what the expectation is, you know when things are happening, and you can reiterate and do continuous improvement when you follow an approach and it's standardized. So you're going to look at, when you identify, you're going to look at your risk. So we talked about the risk to the organization. Now this is not going to be the risk that your patch management program isn't working. That's not this risk. This risk is, what does it mean if I have infiltration into or I have exploitation of a system and somebody comes in and infiltrates my network, takes my PII, or gets into my bank accounts or my banks or my financial statements. That's the kind of risk we're really looking for, is how am I going to impact my organization? And from there, you'll build the metrics through those business objectives. You're going to tie the two together. You're going to understand at a strategic level or through your senior leaders, which they typically roll down, what are we really trying to do this year? And I thought it was interesting that the earlier one, I've actually worked with Brian Saylor. I was on the security team for his organization at the time, and I did cyber programs. One of the things that I found interesting was this idea that security, I said to him after, security actually protects the value too. Because you can say that, well, I couldn't get my app out, or I couldn't get that specific service out. Yes, but if it went out and it's unsecure and somebody comes in and you have you basically have reputational risk, you have, which then gets to your shareholders, or you have strategic risk where they shut down entire services. Those are things you have to think about from a security side, and it's not that we're trying to inhibit, we're really trying to think about how do you protect at the same time, and it is a balance that you have to find. So anyway. So looking at design, you're really going to then go into what are my key indicators. So we talked about key indicators, and the big thing here is you're going to put those indicators against a business process, or again, a capability, a tool. And the reason being is because you're going to watch that target. So you're going to set upper and lower spec limits. You're going to have a threshold, or you're going to have something like a trigger. And when those are hit, that says, oh, too risky, I have too many exceptions to this policy, I've got multiple issues, all my alarms are going off, my risk is too high, I need to adjust. That then allows you to go into those treatments. So when you think about the targets, that's really about that where do you live and where do you want to live, or what's making you uncomfortable. I always find that when I worked with executives, they never wanted to do risk appetite. It was like the most painful exercise we would go through. Why? Because I don't want to commit to that. What happens if we actually hit it? What happens if everything goes wrong? Yeah, what if you tell somebody you never actually paid attention to it? That's even worse, because you've actually seen companies crash over that. So I think that's one of those things is you set the targets, and again, they're not set in stone. You can do ranges if it makes someone feel better. It's really just about giving you that comfort level, like when are you going to start not being able to sleep at night? When do you want me to escalate to you? That's your target. And then data collection and automation. So we did talk about automation also. And one of the things with data collection is get a single source of the truth. One of the things I found during GRCU projects and implementations of big data, you have to have a single source of the truth, and you have to define it ahead of time. Then you can automate it, pull it, and you're always talking the same. And one of the examples I always give it, I worked for a large energy company, 21 billion, we were trading at $100, we were doing awesome. We were doing data collection one day, and they said, okay, how much energy do we produce? And 4 people answered, and they were all different answers. And we said, well, how could that be? How are you saying we produce different levels of energy? Like, don't we have certain assets? One number. Oh no, we produce energy at so if you defined it as total production at the source, that was one number. Well, then it's, well, how much did we use and how much did we actually have at the hub to sell? Because that's actually more important. Revenue is always important. So that was another number. And so we just kept going through this exercise, and eventually we said, okay, we need to define. When we say in the room, especially when we're doing board and credit agency reporting, we're like, what is the number and how are we defining it? Very good point to data collection, so that you know where to draw it from and you know what to bound your data at, and you're not just capturing everything. And from there, of course, my favorite is take action. You're either going to treat the risk, and again, you can avoid it, you can mitigate it, and then you're going to look at performance management. And that's where you have those actions. What does that plan look like? What are my controls? How am I going to respond to that? Whether it's going by another cybersecurity tool, I say that because we usually have anywhere from 20 to 40 at all the organizations, or it's going and putting a process in place or a management tool. And again, I always like to give a practical exercise. One of my favorites is unauthorized access to PII. Your risk example, and I am a traditionalist, a risk is something that's against an asset, that's a threat, it's a vulnerability, it's an impact. Like, risk is not the internet. Well, what about the internet? Everybody uses it. Is it really a risk? It's the cyber threat exploits my vulnerability to gain access to my system, unauthorized access. My root causes, so going back to thinking about what's causing that or what those actions are, you're looking at my patches weren't conducted. So that's, again, a security. It's a control, because patching and that program is a control. But also my system vulnerabilities remain unaddressed. What I always try to bring to the table as the oversight, security oversight with a patching and vulnerability program is, you don't only patch vulnerabilities. So what are the other treatments we could do? So you didn't patch it, what else could we do? That can reduce it as well, that can mitigate. So those are things you need to think about. And then of course our KRIs is patch latency timeframes. You're looking at high risk vulnerabilities over 30 days. Your percent of vulnerability is not addressed. So again, these are going to give you indications that something's not going right. You're not following your controls, you're not following your policy, and eventually you're going to have to look at what's going on in your organization, and do you have to change your program. So bringing it all full circle, you're going to look at what is my program, or what is my initiative, what's my objective, what's my risk to that specific program or objective or the organization, and then look at the metrics in alignment with that. Now I've added the maturity model, and this one is the NIST, CSF. You can pick any of them. I've worked in the ISO, I've worked in COVID, CMMC, I've worked in NIST 800 and NIST CSF. So they all come together and they're very similar. What you're going to want to do is look at that maturity model or that category. And the reason being is, one, you want to see that you've spread it out. You don't want to only do protect. You don't only want to live in one area. It goes back to people, process, technology, and ensure that you spread out your program so that you're addressing all the areas at least once. That ensures that you have a holistic program. So now I'll go into some cyber program dashboards. I'm a visual person, and so one of the things that I used to develop a lot of was these dashboards. I do like BI products today, they're much better, but what you can see is a control catalog. And again, going back to that security posture and the security dashboards, what I typically have seen and what comes up is, well, how is my controls doing based on what I expected for the outcome? How am I measuring them? What's the maturity of them? How are they doing what I think they're doing? And again, being secure is good, but it doesn't mean you're addressing all your risks, which is why it's important to go back to risks and objectives and understanding how that ties back. And then of course you have the cyber program security posture. This has the people, process, and technology piece. It has some risk ratings. It has some, patch programs. So it's really capturing all angles of that prospect of, well, I have a program or I have an initiative going. I'm spending on this program. I have all the people lined up. I have all my policies in place. I know what my requirements are. Now I just need to measure and make sure that I'm living where I feel comfortable. And I always like to have the green, yellow, red, because what I say is, if you know the days of when SOX first came out, as in Sarbanes-Oxley, you know that companies actually got hurt financially by trying to implement every control at 100% of the time. It's not possible. You have to make decisions about where your security is sometimes going to have to linger a little bit, where you can't spend, but what are some other controls or what are some other processes you can put in place? But this is where I always do the green, yellow, red, and we have orange on this one, and those triggers are really there and the trending's there, because you really want to monitor it, because sometimes you can actually live in the orange and you don't trigger until it trends upward, and then you're like, okay, now we can't take on any more risk, but we could live in the orange for a little while. And that actually helps with that action, return on investment, and also the decisions. But going back to our risk dashboard, now why I say this has all of my cyber program on, and why this is a little different than if I had a cyber program or a security dashboard versus risk, is it's actually about the status of these. So each of these programs is actually addressing an objective. So if I see that I'm not meeting those greens for my program and the outcomes of those, that's when I see risk escalating, because I'm not going to meet the end of my implementation, or I'm not going to put that specific technology in place, which then doesn't allow me to meet my objectives, and I may take on risks that I didn't know. So that's why I see that as a little different than what I had before when I said it was, and similar things were in a security dashboard. Additionally, you have that program risk dashboard. Risks is vulnerabilities plus threats plus assets. So if you know what your assets are, so going back to inventory, knowing what you have, knowing what's happening to them, and understanding the threats that are coming at you and that probability, much better chance of catching or mitigating the right risk and ensuring that you protect the value of your organization. Going into policies and standards, that's again their governance side, but ensuring that you're following your direction. Policies should be based around not only the requirements from a legal perspective or a regulatory perspective, but also from an organizational perspective. And then you have training and awareness, again, the people. You always want to focus on your people. And config management I have in there. So some things to avoid. Using metrics that no one understands. There's no point, and just you could have the greatest metric in the world and you put it up there and everyone's like, I don't know why we're measuring that, I don't know what it means. That's where you start to lose people, and they lose that understanding and also buy-in for those metrics. Cluttering up your dashboard and your report with low-value graphics. Less is always more when it comes to reporting and dashboards, especially if you want decisions and action. Failing to match the metrics to your goals. So going back to what I said, where you're measuring something but you never plan to do anything about it, you're just, again, taking up a lot of time and effort. It's not valuable to anyone. And then too much dependency on words. A lot of people, you got to have the words, but you really do have to focus visually, because you're trying to cater to audiences that Some people learn or capture by audio, some are visual, and some are I have to do it. I have to understand what you're saying, or I have to see it done. And that's why I always like to have my examples up here. So you can tell I've done a lot of training, especially adult ed. You have to hit all those aspects. And so implementing the approach, I wanted to go through kind of my story. I worked through, or my experience. I've worked at a local company here, which since I actually did this program has changed over, I will say. And one of the things that I did when I came into the program, so I worked for the CISO and the CTO, and I supported the CIO, but the CISO was really my driver. So I worked for him, and he said, I'm trying to put the NIST CSF program in place. And as I'm putting this program in place, I'm thinking about all the things that I need to do. We want to do all of these programs, but I don't have any regulatory drivers, and I don't really have as much buy-in as I would like, because they don't see the value of security in a non-regulated, very open, creative environment. So let's talk about those business objectives then. What's of value to the organization that we could define our program around, our maturity, and then what were the key risks to that organization? So we started there, we took the objectives, we sat down with the CIO and CTO, we said, what's important? What should we be bringing to you from where do you want to make a difference? What kind of technologies are we thinking? And so we started to map some of those out and think about the problem we were trying to solve. So we defined the problem, we looked at what the objectives were, and we identified the macro risks. We then went into implement. So we started to implement some initiatives, and actually you saw multiple dashboards that we used, and that was actually our program dashboard. We started to look at where the focus was. So we identified that we had a lot of unsupported technologies, out-of-date versions, and we realized we weren't patching as much as we should be, and our vulnerabilities were really our greatest or our weakest link at the time. So we started to look at those initiatives where you saw patch management, configuration management, and then we also identified that phishing was becoming very significant for us. We'd actually had 2 incidents that occurred where somebody had been phished through an email and had opened us up, and we'd actually had money transacted. So those were things, okay, we need to do training and awareness. We need to make sure that everyone understands that this is something that's going on, whether it's phishing, whaling, any kind of social engineering that was happening. So we went over all of that, and we put that in place as well. But then we had to define those metrics and say what was going to be valuable to show success for our program. We did use the NIST CSF. We did look at the maturity model. We had a third party come in, they assessed us, and then we continued to use that assessment, or the context of those questions and outcomes, as well as what NIST CSF controls were trying to achieve. And then we would measure them periodically, usually quarterly, go out, we'd assess it, we'd ask questions, we'd make sure some things were in line with where we expected them, and then ultimately we were able to create metrics. We made sure they were in line, again, with our maturity or with our business objectives and those risks that we had identified. So then we decided to measure. Once we decided to measure and set up our metrics, we said, what are the data sources? How can we automate this? How can we put this into place? And so then we were able to develop our dashboard. Now we did do a color-coded dashboard at one point, and that's the one you saw with the stoplight. That was our very high level. This is how our program's going. This is where our risk is, and things that we would actually propose for spending or a add-on to the initiative, or something that we had to change. Our plan was not working. One of the things that we did do is we were at, interestingly enough, when we finished the first assessment, we were at like a 2 out of 5 for the NIST CSF. It was not a good day, but we said, we don't have any regulatory requirements. We're going to put some stuff in place. We're going to start paying more attention. We started to automate, and we started to act. We started to change the behavior. We set up those governance groups. We had regular meetings. We talked about what was working and what wasn't working. We talked about what we needed support from the IT sections. We talked about the business leaders, what they needed to be thinking about and how they were supporting these metrics as well. And we also talked about where they were getting reported. You'd be surprised what the driver or the change in behavior is when you're like, yeah, this is getting reported to the executive committee and the board, and they're asking these questions, and this is what they want to know about. All of a sudden, everybody perks up. Oh, well, let me change my behavior a little bit because I want to make sure I look good when you put that on paper. So those are things that changes that behavior, because what gets measured gets done. I learned that back in the Six Sigma days. And then what we did was we continuously improved. You know, we realized where we were not doing well or where something was working or wasn't working, and we changed the plan. We said, nope, we're going to put more emphasis on patch management. We're going to really buckle down on it. We ended up in 18 months moving from a 2, I think it was a 2.1 overall, up to a 2.9. And we actually saw an increase in our maturity as well as a secure posture, but we knew our risks better and we were managing them better. So key takeaways. Measure what matters. Again, what gets measured gets done. If it's not actionable, don't measure it. Make relevant at all the levels. I showed you how to kind of cascade it down, why it's relevant to talk to each level of your organization. And ultimately at the bottom, it helps them understand how they're helping the organization achieve its objectives and be part of the bigger team. Especially if you're bonusing, that's always a biggie. Tie to initiatives and objectives, going back to what's the value add for the organization and the business, and how is their revenue being generated, and how are you protecting it? How are you thinking about it? And then how are you measuring your success to align to that? And then make it a journey and not a destination. Cyber programs should always be moving. They should always be flexing. We know our threats change. I think, you know, as you think about SolarWinds, Log4j, all of those things were surprises in a sense. We have to be able to change, and your program will give you that idea of, one, what you're measuring, but how you can make those changes more easily, how you're documenting them, and actually see how they all tie together to make your organization more successful. So I'm going to take questions, comments. Yes.
On page 9,
Yep. Gonna make me.
you talk about portfolio. And I noticed patch management right there. Does antivirus software fit in patch management, or is that a tool under this?
So if you think about, thank you. Based on my program, where would antivirus fit? Would it fit under patch management? And I would say this goes back to, what are you ultimately trying to measure?
Reiterate the question.
That was the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, that's okay. I would say that this goes back to how you define it. Now, from an antivirus, I wouldn't necessarily say that fits under patch management. Patch management was more about when you have those open vulnerabilities, are you moving them through faster? Do you have unsupported systems? But antivirus would be a subsidy, or like a secondary control that could take the place or help out if you're not doing something, just like protecting or taking a system offline or an application that, again, wasn't being secure. So you have to define what falls into those areas, and it's not prescriptive in that sense. As you think about the NIST controls though, yes, they will actually tell you where all of that lives. They'll tell you it lives in Protect, or it lives in the NIST 853 series, you know, it lives in, you know, this specific program. So I think from that perspective, it goes back to your framework, and it would tie back to your control structure you want to use. But at the same time, this is an opportunity that you define that and you scope it for the organization. Yes?
Do you suggest or have any advice regarding tooling that maps controls to, so my organization adheres to high trust, and so if you're potentially going to be looking at a GRC tool to be able to map back, do you have anything that you might see?
For high trust specifically,
Just generally something that
yes, I've actually done high trust, and it was on RSAMs. But what I can say is, yes, your GRC tools, that's the intent. They're intended to set it up. So it really goes back to, Many of the tools are the same now with just a little twist because they are doing a standard approach, and they actually, they started back in like 2005, 2006, really becoming popular. The first one I did was 2007. What you're really doing there is mapping those controls to your policies and your standards requirements, and then ultimately looking at your risks. So the tools themselves are actually set up that way. It's actually a category or a alignment, tiering it up. So you'd have your, what's my regulatory requirements, and then you would look at what my standards and framework is, and then you put your controls. So you can actually see how they then tie back to your assets, third parties, business process, and then you would tie risk to them. So it actually is a full circle, and that's their relational databases. So they actually do map for you.
And you would suggest that versus manually?
Yes, highly recommend it. What we found, actually as a client, we did our, like I said, in 2007, I did my first GRC implementation. We were able to reduce our controls by 40% overnight because we realized we were duplicating. Multiple organizations or business units were doing the same control, just a little different, but we were ultimately meeting the same objective. So we just started doing control objectives, and then we would basically control once, satisfy many, and so you will find that it's very efficient if you are able to map it.
You mentioned about interesting drivers for metrics. Can you just give some examples based on your experience? What were the drivers for metrics and indicating?
So I'm going to reiterate the question because I did forget yours. The drivers of the metrics, so what are some? Again, I would look at from a driver's perspective, going back to your root causes, and sorry, I'll just go back to, I have to make sure I know where I am. Nope, it was down. So you're gonna look at what your root causes were, you're gonna look at what your targets are, or your business capabilities that you wanna build. You're gonna look at your objectives. You always want to make sure that you're thinking about what your objective is. But one of the big ones is, for instance, like your risk. So you want to look at your macro drivers as well as your micro. But when I talk macro, you know, if I'm in a transportation company or transportation business where my product is either on the ground or I've got to move it, and you're thinking about what's going on, you know, even overseas in Ukraine or the Middle East, and our policies and how those cascade and impact certain things in the United States, those are going to be risks that you want to think about. So then you want to think about what my objectives, if I'm trying to earn more money and bring down the cost of my products, well, then the root cause is going to be, I need to think through some of those policy implications that are going to come to me, and then how do I put specific, and that's more of a, I know it's more of a transpo, from a cyber perspective, I can go back to that one, or from a cyber program IT side, you're going to look at, yeah, again, Russia is trying to infiltrate a lot of companies. So if you know you're on one of their high value target lists, one of the things you're going to want to do is look out for that. So you're going to probably up your scanning. You're going to maybe purchase another tool or have a service put in place, a managed service that helps you look for that. Again, dealing with the federal agencies, that's one of the things that we have to think about when we propose our cyber programs to them, is how do they think through, additional nation states coming after them, or what might be happening because certain people have taken on, an aggressive stance. Robin.
Christine, I know you have a lot of experience working with C-suite people. I would love to hear just a few of your tips and tricks about how do you explain to a C-suite person that doesn't have all the technical knowledge that's in this room. How do you translate for them, what should I be worried about? Risk posture, definition of risk posture, and appropriateness, right? It's that balance, right, between operational risk and reputational risk to your earlier comment. What's your tips and tricks around that area? How do you make it real to them?
So I would say that some of the best conversations, one are, how I've worked for multiple C-suite. In fact, I worked with Robin, and we both worked for the CISO and CTO. And how do I put that conversation in real context for the higher levels and make it more of a strategic conversation, and they can understand it. And I would say one of the things I do is I typically tend to roll things up. So going back to this controls, I'm not going to tell them about every control that's out there. I'm going to talk about control objectives. Are we trying to achieve a certain, level of scanning, or do we have certain levels of expectation around our policies? So I'm going to roll things up more to an overview so that they can quickly understand, okay, what do you need to go drill down on? What do I need to change my plan about? Additionally, I think utilizing taxonomies, or again, grouping things together. So I typically talk to my C-suites about strategic risks. I talk to them about regulatory compliance risks, operational risks, and I don't get down into the little ones. I actually talk about, my operational is my people, process, technology, and business process. Business transactions, so that they understand, okay, that's what I'm saying when I say my operational risk is up or it's increasing. Okay, what does that mean to me, and what do we need to do differently? So rolling a lot of the information up for them and aggregating it at a higher level, and then putting it in buckets and making it real to them is much easier to have the conversation and they understand, because then you can drill down after. But if you start too low, then it just becomes too much of a, well, why is that more valuable than that? Why is one asset more valuable than another? It has to be talked about the same. And the other thing I found was really tricky is taking IT and putting it in line with your other assets. So if you have a business, like I worked for an energy company, our assets and our fuels were the biggest thing for us. They were our revenue generators. But yet our IT assets were running a lot of those, and we're really responsible for the backbone of those assets. So I said, IT has to be an asset now, and how do we have that conversation? And those kind of conversations are changing. You just have to understand how to group it together and then think about it as they're relevant and what the risks are to both of them. Because one of the things you'll find is, the revenue generators are going to be what people focus on, but when the revenue generators now are so heavily dependent on IT and infrastructure, that's one of the things you have to start changing that conversation and making it real to them. So I have a few more minutes if anyone has a last question, comment. So I will say, how many people feel they could put a cyber program or an IS program together at this point, at least with one or two things? Great. So again, thank you. And I'm also, I did not put my contact information, but I'll be around. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm local to Knoxville, and so I hope that this is helpful. And like I said, I'm always willing to share whatever I have, and I have a lot of other metrics and a lot of other information as well. So thank you.